So we're here with a real doctor, and he's gonna spill the beans on his perspective of the optimal human diet. So introduce yourself.
So I'm an NHS doctor. I've got 16 years experience in the NHS. I specialise in emergency medicine and trauma, and I'm here to talk about nutrition.
This space needs some authority, some authority, because vegans think that all the authorities are telling them it's healthy for them at all stages of life. So it's great you're here. I appreciate it.
So should we start by talking about that? Maybe just talk about the nutritional aspects from the medical aspects of the vegan.
Yes,
vegan diet?
Start by sharing your perspective, your knowledge on the nutrition and the medical aspects of the vegan diet.
So ethics aside and environmental issues aside, purely from a nutritional point of view, it is a deficient diet.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, for that reason alone, does it even constitute being a diet? Can a regime that is nutritionally deficient actually fulfill the criteria to be a diet? So it's, from my perspective, it's a regime that will result in an inexorable decline in health over months, years, or even decades.
Mm-hmm.
It sometimes takes years for these nutritional deficiencies to manifest themselves.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we can go through some of them.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it boasts a total absence of vitamin B12. All right, vitamin B12 is synthesized within the guts of herbivores.
Mm-hmm.
You cannot get B12 from plants. You have to get B12 from flesh. So vegans will have to take a supplement. It's going to be extremely deficient in vitamin D and calcium, and I'd be extremely concerned for long-term bone health. All right. Best sources of vitamin D, again, are going to be flesh, meat, fish, dairy, milk.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to be deficient in iron.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So flesh contains heme iron, and vegetable sources contains non-heme iron.
Yeah.
Heme iron is so much better absorbed than non-heme iron, and all the anti-nutrients that vegetables
on top of it
as well.
Yeah.
So all this this myth about Popeye and his spinach, actually, not only is it full of non-heme iron, which is polyabsorbed anyway, but then you've got all the oxalic acid on top of it. So actually, the overall bioavailability of iron from that source spinach is actually really low.
Mm-hmm.
Omega-3, all right. So there are 3 essential omega-3 fatty acids: DHA, EPA, and ALA. The only omega-3 you can get from plants is ALA. DHA, which is absolutely critical for brain development, is absent in the plant kingdom. There is some biochemical conversion from ALA to DHA, but it's a very limited process. So I'd be concerned that vegans are going to be deficient in omega-3 as well.
You mentioned, they need to take supplements, but a lot of what I'm looking at shows that they don't even work properly. The supplements, we need it in our food.
Yeah, correct. And I think you have to question the bioavailability. Let's take B12 for example. You have to question the bioavailability. If you've got a lump of meat and you've got a capsule, clearly you're going to be absorbing a lot more B12 from the product as Mother Nature has intended.
Yeah, and then it might even be toxic, the actual supplement.
Correct. I saw a lady in the emergency department, I think maybe 10 years ago in North East London. She was a vegan. She was in her mid-30s, and she tripped and stumbled and she fell onto her outstretched hand. This is a 35-year-old lady, and she completely shattered her wrist. Right? And when I actually put up the x-ray, you could see that there was so little bone density. I had to almost do a double take. There was so little mineral content just on observation of that x-ray. We had to have a bit of a conversation, and she, by her own admission, she was a vegan, which is her choice, but that had been instrumental in how her bones had reacted to a very simple, low-energy mechanism.
Yeah, it's what you see in these children that are reported in the newspapers and stuff, that born with rickets or deformed bones, or bones that just shatter as they walk.
Yeah, correct. And you read in the papers. I mean, this thing about raising children as vegans, I don't know if it's possible to do that in a way that's considered to be healthy. But I think there was something in the papers a year or two ago about a Belgian couple that were actually given a suspended jail sentence because their child had actually died. So the judge actually gave them a prison sentence. So I'm not sure that that's the right thing to do. The absence of those nutrients during such vital stages of development.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, it's scary. So what, in your view, is the optimal human diet?
I think that's a really good question, and I think the answer to that lies in our evolutionary history.
Mm-hmm.
So I think as human beings, as Homo sapiens, our nutritional requirements are fundamentally shaped by our evolution. So we share a common ancestor with the modern day chimpanzee, and we branched off about 7 million years ago. And for that period of time, for millions of years, we were surviving on the plains of Africa, the African savannah, living predominantly on a meat-based diet. What's the evidence for this? Well, there's good archaeological and anthropological evidence that omega-3, for example, was highly instrumental in the evolution and development of the human brain, as we evolved from Homo habilis to Homo erectus to primitive hominids with larger brains. That omega-3 was highly instrumental. Where does omega-3 come from? It comes from meat. The most predominant source of omega-3, DHA, comes from meat. You're not going to get that from plants. Even evidence such as drawings, cave drawings of hominids using tools. Those tools weren't used to catch vegetables. Those tools were used to hunt and to kill. Anthropological archaeologists have studied bone chemistry, the mineral content of bone. So if you take a herbivore and you take a carnivore and you ground down that bone and you add acid to it and you use a device called a mass spectrometer to analyse the the isotopic composition of carbon and nitrogen in that bone, what emerges is a clear pattern. The isotopic composition that has a herbivorous profile, the herbivorous profile has one isotopic composition, and the carnivorous profile has a very distinct isotopic composition. And if you take the bones of our hominid ancestors and modern humans, which our anthropological archaeologists have done, and you subject those bones to the same process, the bones come out as carnivorous.
Yeah.
This is uncontestable scientific fact. Our hominid ancestors on the African savannah were gorging themselves on a predominantly meat-based diet. Okay, there were no vegetarians or vegans amongst our hominid ancestors. They would have died. They wouldn't have survived on those plains of Africa. And actually, for most of the year, that the land was desertified and desolate, and there were no greens available. Okay, you had to eat meat to survive, and that's what shapes our evolution in terms of our nutritional requirements, in terms of what we genetically and physiologically adapted to. So I think. So the answer to that question, probably a paleo-esque type diet is probably what constitutes optimal human nutrition. So meat, fish, some greens, and maybe some nuts and fruit probably constitutes an optimal human diet.
Yeah, but predominantly meat.
Meat.
Yeah,
I would say.
Yeah.
I mean, you certainly as a, you cannot derive the same nutrient density from plants as you can from animals.
Yeah.
This is absolutely packed full of nutrients. And also, just look at the digestive systems. I think that there's an argument that we're herbivorous. We're actually not herbivorous at all. Okay, we've already discussed why we're carnivorous. But if you look at the alimentary system of a Homo sapien, okay, it's a carnivorous alimentary system. It's a short gut. We've got a small cecum. All right.
Well, it's an appendix.
It's an appendix. So the gastric parietal cells of the stomach secrete something called intrinsic factor. That intrinsic factor binds to B12, and that intrinsic factor B12 complex is absorbed in the terminal ileum. So our guts are processed and evolved to absorb B12. Where does B12 come from? It comes from meat. You can't get it from plants.
They say eat the the vegans.
I mean, so we're not herbivorous. We don't have the multiple, compartmental stomach and a rumen. The digestive system of a herbivore is an extremely long digestive system. It's lined with trillions of cellulase-producing bacteria. Cellulase being the enzyme that breaks down cellulose, which is the predominant polysaccharide in plants. We don't possess those cellulase-producing bacteria.
Yeah.
All right. So we have a carnivorous gut. Again, it's uncontestable.
So, what about this myth regarding cholesterol and animal fats that's been going around for over 50 years?
That's a really good question. And so the notion that a lower carbohydrate regimen may be beneficial for us traces its origin to the 19th century. There was a guy called William Banting. William Banting was an undertaker who was morbidly obese, and on the advice of his physician, he adopted a lower carbohydrate diet. So he had a very high saturated fat and high protein diet, and he lost a lot of weight. The regime was successful. And he wrote about it in 1863, I think. So the notion that a lower carbohydrate regimen may be beneficial has a pretty long history. And then you've got the 7 countries study, which Ansel Keys was an American physiologist who in the 1950s, he just got it into his head that saturated fat was associated with ill health and cardiovascular disease. And so he published the 7 countries study, and essentially he looked to demonstrate that high fat consumption was linked to heart disease. Mm-hmm. And he looked at data from many, many countries, but actually what he did was he falsified some of the data and omitted some of the data. So for example, France and Switzerland, they're countries that have very high consumption of saturated fat, but guess what? Very low rates of heart disease. All right. And Ansel Keys omitted that data from the study, as he did with 15 other countries. But nevertheless, he continued to drive this message really hard that, fats were bad for us. And so the low fat mantra was born. Mm-hmm. And it was pushed really hard, and it gained a lot of traction. And it was pushed by the American Heart Association, and everyone started to eat low fat. But what do you replace fat with? If you take out fat from something, what do you replace it with? Carbohydrates and sugar. And what happened to the population over the last 50 years? Is, the Western world has become morbidly obese. So in 1980, only 15% of the population had a BMI above the 85th centile. Currently, nearly 60%, certainly of the US population, has a BMI above the 85th centile. So, what the hell has happened? The short answer is carbohydrates, sugar. Okay, so let's just talk about the science of it. Sugar is not a nutrient. All right, sugar provides calories, but it's of no nutritive value whatsoever. So the definition of a nutrient is something that when removed from the diet induces ill health. All right, so there are essential fatty acids and there are essential amino acids. If you remove those from the diet, you become very sick and die. But if you remove sugar from the diet, actually the opposite happens. You actually thrive. Yeah. All right, so you go to school at biology, and we're all taught about the 3 macronutrients: proteins, fats, and carbohydrates. But actually, is carbohydrate really a macronutrient? Because you can survive without it. So it's gained a lot of traction. People have become very, very sick. And in 2008, this is where you've heard of Professor Noakes.
Oh yeah.
So he's the.
I'm glad you mentioned.
Yeah. Him. So exactly. So he's one of the champions of the lower carbohydrate regimen, and the study that he talks about was a very compelling 2008 randomized controlled trial published in the New England Journal of Medicine, which is a very highly esteemed peer-reviewed journal. And the study looked at over 322 patients with metabolic syndrome. Okay, and it stratified those patients into 2 groups. One group were given a high-fat, low-carbohydrate diet, like a ketogenic type diet. Yeah. And the other group received a traditional, low-fat, high-carbohydrate diet. And the results are really interesting because the patients who were stratified into the high saturated fat group, low carb group, had demonstrable reversals and lowering of their cholesterol, triglycerides, their HDL cholesterols went down, their waist circumference went down, their blood sugars went down, and their blood pressure came down. Sure. And that's really compelling evidence. So we have lived a life for the last 50 years, with that nutritional paradigm shift that took place, which has had catastrophic consequences. Mm-hmm. So, there's really good evidence now that a lower carbohydrate, higher fat regime is actually beneficial for our health. Now, you talked about saturated fat. The traditional notion is that saturated fat causes heart disease, cholesterol causes heart disease. There are 3 really, really good studies, high-level evidence studies, which demonstrate that saturated fat pretty much has exonerated as being atherogenic, causing heart disease.
Yeah.
There's a really good 2010 randomised, it's a 2010 meta-analysis. There's a 2017 meta-analysis and a 2015 systematic review published in the BMJ, demonstrating that saturated fat is actually not the driver of cardiovascular disease. Okay. So it's led to this nutritional paradigm shift, and I think we need to have a bit of a rethink. So cholesterol is actually a really important nutrient. It's essential for vitamin D, for bile, for hormone synthesis, and 85% of the cholesterol in your bloodstream is generated by your liver. Only 15% comes from what you're directly eating. And what influences how much the liver makes is things like trans fats and processed foods and alcohol, all the shit we put into our diets. So having a high cholesterol diet per se, like have a couple of extra egg yolks, is not going to cause heart disease.
That's good to know. Because in my experience is it in fact is very beneficial for you, cholesterol.
Yeah.
So apparently 50% of our cells are made of cholesterol.
It's part of the cell, it's part of the phospholipids. It's absolutely essential.
Yeah.
And you'd simply die without it. In order for a diet to be truly considered optimal, it has to be healthy over multiple generations. Can it sustain a population health over multiple generations? I think that can definitely be said of the Mediterranean diet and the Japanese diet for sure, and perhaps the Inuit diet. But it cannot be said yet of the vegan diet. There's no evidence that it sustains health in a population over multiple generations. And I very much doubt it will be able to. So Prem, did you want to talk about anti-nutrients?
Yeah,
because it's not a term that I've sort of readily heard. So just clarify what you mean by anti-nutrient.
Okay, so it's actually interesting because the very company I used to run specialised in what we call activating nuts, which is just a term we coined basically for what ancient people did naturally, which was if they would ever had to eat nuts, like for example, Native Americans ate a lot of acorns, and acorns are an extreme example of anti-nutrients. They're so full of tannins. If you just tried eating that straight, you'd gag. It'd be like eating pure tannins. So they would actually soak these acorns in a stream for days, mash them up, soak them, and the stream would just take away the anti-nutrients. But you never take them all away, and what I've now discovered is they are in every plant. Like they're concentrated in the seed or the grain or the nut, because that's the most prized possession of that plant. They don't want you to eat their seed, but they're least in fruit, which is why I can stomach a little bit of fruit, because they want you to eat the fruit, because then you don't actually digest the seed and you lay it down for them somewhere else. So it's all about just understanding the basics of what's going on with nature. So even in green leafies like spinach, for example, is full of oxalates. Exactly, and that literally will make you bleed when you piss. And it's even been found lodged in people's brains. But the core of it is that all plants contain anti-nutrients of various sorts. There's goitrogens, tannins.
Yeah, correct. And we're fundamentally not herbivores. And you've got phytates, grains are full of phytates which impair absorption of calcium and iron. You've got lectin, which grains are very rich in, and lectin just plays havoc with the gastrointestinal system. Have you ever had, legumes or beans and stuff? It just gives you horrible gas and bloating, doesn't it?
It's not.
This whole thing about red meat and cancer. So the evidence is actually more strongly for processed meat.
Yeah.
All right. So the bacon, the sausages, the burgers, not as opposed to the the organic grass-fed.
Which is
steaks.
a joke again, because that's what's added to it.
Exactly. So bacon, for example, is laced with nitrites to preserve the shelf life of that bacon.
I had a bite of bacon the other day, and I got a rash within 5 minutes.
And obviously, when you ingest that, what happens to that nitrite? It's converted by a process of nitrisation in the stomach to chemicals called N-nitrosamines, which are carcinogenic. But actually, there's some evidence that polyphenols in green tea inhibit that process.
Yeah.
If you're eating 50 grams of processed meat a day, so a couple of rashers of bacon, I think it's been estimated that you increase your colorectal cancer risk by 18%. But that's for processed meat. That's what the evidence is not for this stuff. Is the organic grass-fed meat that our ancestors were eating.
It's just a general understanding that we need to have.
Exactly.
Like you're saying, that we're not designed to deal with those.
Exactly.
You need a very specialized digestive system to deal with those. And even then, you're going to have still trouble pulling your nutrition from it, meaning herbivores like ruminants literally regurgitate their food 200 times, as well as have 4 stomachs.
Exactly.
It's crazy. And then monkeys,
exactly,
which is the number one correlation used by vegans, say, look, we're just like monkeys, but we're not. Actually, we've evolved a hell of a lot different by that.
Yeah.
But monkeys literally eat their feces.
Correct.
It's so inefficient that they need to keep passing it through.
Correct. And this is what a lot of herbivores do, because the nutrient density of plants is so low. Okay, I mean, what do herbivores do? They graze all day. We certainly don't graze all day. Why do they graze all day? Because they need such a huge amount of biomass to extract the maximum amount of nutrients they can.
Yeah.
And they eat their feces and they regurgitate and re-eat it to extract as much nutrient density as possible. That's not the case with meat. It's the case with plants, because of the reasons we've talked about, because of the anti-nutrients, because of the low nutrient density.
Exactly, and there's a reason we're humans and we evolved the big brain and all this stuff.
Correct.
We didn't evolve it by having to masticate all day long on plants.
Correct.
It's common sense. The whole of the vegan movement is basically resting on this idea that they are cruelty-free and they cause less harm to animals because they don't eat animal products.
Yeah.
What's your thought on that?
Sure. Well, I think you know a lot about this. You know probably more about this than me. But from my point of view, I can easily see how people are seduced into the whole animal cruelty thing, and how people are beguiled into some of these myths around animal agriculture, livestock, and the environment. But veganism doesn't save the countless mice, worms, rabbits, and snakes that are decimated in the process of generating all that land for monocropping of soy,
in a very unhumane way.
Veganism doesn't solve the problem of runoff of pesticides, and it doesn't save the frogs, fish and other aquatic animals from pesticide runoff. It doesn't improve the conditions of human labourers in places like South America and the quinoa industry that are enduring very hazardous and extreme conditions. And I think something like 70% of child labour in South America is attributed to food supply chains.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't solve the problem of all this. For example, soy and quinoa. It's got to get from South America to the UK. What about the CO2 that's going out into the atmosphere in the process of transportation of all that soy and quinoa to the UK? So, there can be a tendency to compartmentalise ethical issues and focusing on animals and focusing on the perceived effect on livestock and the environment, but it actually leaves most of the world's principal issues wholly unresolved.
It's a very childlike way to look at it without looking at the bigger picture.
Exactly. What about terrorism? What about the plastification of our oceans? What about urban sprawl, overpopulation? What about antibiotic resistance? What about Ebola and other infectious diseases? What about pollution and combustion of fossil fuels? It leaves most of these issues, more important issues, unresolved. So I think some of these highly unpalatable things have to be stomached, before bulldozing this cruelty-free argument. What are your thoughts, Prem?
I mean, my thoughts are, at whatever facet you look at the vegan agenda and taking on the perspective of a vegan, okay, let's create less cruelty, and you go through it, like you've mentioned, the environment, which includes transportation of food, the whole devastation of monocrops, whether it's for the environment, for the animals, for the soil, for the earth, for our children, basically. That's causing the devastation. It's plain to see. I'm not saying this the whole time to sort of only to put down the vegan movement. I want people to wake up to this common sense. It's just obvious that it creates more harm. So then what are they doing, you know? They really can see these plain facts, that it creates more harm and creates harm to themselves and their children if they're pushing it on them. So it really is like lunacy. It really is to me.
I think one of the forgive me if I'm mistaken, because as I've said, you know a lot about this, Prem, but one of the myths is the degree to which livestock production and animal agriculture contributes to CO2 and greenhouse gas emissions, and I think these figures are grossly overestimated. Whereas I think it's probably something like maybe 5% of all greenhouse gas emissions is attributed to livestock and animal agriculture, not the sort of whatever it is 60 or 70%. Mammals have been farting on this planet for millions of years, and they'll be farting on this planet for millions of years to come. And deforestation in South America, and I think there's a bit of a myth around that deforestation is linked to agriculture, but I don't think that's the case. I think
not the case.
Foreign companies are after large foreign companies are after the timber. Okay, and most of South America and Brazil is forest and rainforest, and most of those livestock have evolved to live in, forest environments and woods, and actually don't want to be in the open. The soil is actually not particularly suitable for intensive farming. They don't vaccinate their livestock, so that immediately renders the meat unsuitable for exportation. And actually, they hardly produce enough for themselves, the yield, let alone for the wider world. So I don't think there's any large-scale agricultural agenda behind all the deforestation that's going on in South America, as reprehensible as it is.
Yeah, it doesn't make any sense. I mean, firstly, they also omit the fact that the actual CO2 created by the cows is part of the natural cycle, and it's essential actually that they're bringing up CO2 from the soil, which is brought up by the grass, and it's essential part of the cycle. There are different types of CO2. There's poisonous man-made CO2s, and then with South America, it's literally, and all over the world, the land that is actually used for agriculture is rarely used for cattle. The land that's used for cattle is land you cannot use for anything else.
Yeah, correct.
So at every angle you look at this, none of these vegan facts make any sense in the real world. Yeah,
I think there are a lot of myths, and a lot of South American farmers, as you say, will actually prefer to rear their cattle in a forest or woodland type environment.
It's much better. It's making a comeback, actually, the forest farming, because it yields better results.
Right.
That's what I'd like to do on my farm. And then this thing that vegans use when they say, oh well, there's you can possibly feed everyone on Earth with cattle because you need 1 acre of land per cow. And firstly, that already starts to break down when you go into forest farming and stuff, and rotational farming. So in a natural environment, they'd be going to different places. And if you do that, that drastically reduces. Suddenly you only need a third or a quarter of an acre.
If you allow them to free roam.
Exactly. And then you'll find they're eating insects, they're eating, there's videos of cows chasing and eating mice. Horses catching birds and eating them. They know it's good for them.
You really are a man of the soil, and I applaud you for that. I applaud you for that.
I am. I mean, I'm lucky I did grow up in the countryside.
And it's very sad because the Aboriginal population of northwestern Australia, and the classic 1983 study is, as things became westernised in northwestern Australia, the introduction of sugar and processed foods and alcohol and all the crap carbohydrates. What happened to the Aboriginals? They blew up. They got diabetes. They got metabolic syndrome. And that classic study from 1983 took a group of these Aboriginals and put them back on the soil. They put them back on the soil in the outbacks of northwestern Australia to resume hunter-gatherer activity. And guess what? It reversed their metabolic syndrome. They gorged themselves off the soil as Mother Nature intended, lots of meat, and they gathered. and all of the metabolic profile normalised.
That's
And I think that's the most compelling evidence. Yeah.
Yeah, it reminds me of this other one. I don't know the details of it, but it was essentially two tribes living remotely, quite close to each other, but didn't have much contact, like far enough away to not really see each other much.
Yeah.
In the mountains. One tribe did not have access to much meat, and the other had plenty of meat. In the one that had not access to much meat, there was all sorts of health conditions.
I'm not
and
surprised.
the one that had plenty of meat, they were the same, similar genetics, everything, but in the ones that had plenty of meat, there was no trace of disease, pretty much.
Yeah.
You know, you don't get much better than that in terms of
It's
a trial,
remarkable.
you know.
It's absolutely remarkable.
Yeah.
One other thing I'll say quickly, Prem, is that if you look at Mother Nature and if you look at animals in the wild, you know, obesity is not something that is demonstrated in the wild. You don't see obese, you know, wildebeest and hamsters and tigers because they're eating as Mother Nature intended.
Yeah.
If you eat as Mother Nature intended, which most of the Western world is not doing, you know, with the alcohol, the processed food, the sugar, then, you know, you become to normalise metabolically. So I think if anyone wants to pursue a good diet, eat as Mother Nature intended is probably the bottom line. Would you agree with that?
Oh yeah, and if you look into it, we mainly evolved and had access to meat with the occasional bit of plant, but that would only be local and in season. So you wouldn't have perpetual tropical fruit and this and that in there. Yeah. So is the NHS an advocate of the vegan diet?
Short answer is no.
Okay.
I know hundreds of doctors, probably one vegan. So it's not something that's been pushed or perpetuated by the NHS.
Good.
And I'm aware that there are some organisations like the World Health Organization and the American Dietetic Association that, but these are not bodies, as far as I know, that the NHS lean on too much. But as far as I know, it's not something it's recommended. It's not something I would recommend for my patients either.
Okay, yeah. Well, as well as those bodies you mentioned, there's also a lot of the mainstream Western media pushing this. Why is this?
I don't have an answer for that. As things stand, I think about 5% of the UK population are vegan, and I think about 2% of the world population are vegan. Over 90% of the world's population choose to eat meat.
Yeah.
And that alone is sufficient to make it a morally acceptable behaviour.
Yeah.
Is it morally acceptable to enjoy a steak? Do I value the taste of a ribeye more than the life of a cow, provided it's been slaughtered in a way that's considered by consensus to be humane? Absolutely. Absolutely. So vegans, unfortunately, will have to ride the wave of moral standards, advancing moral standards, because 90% of the world's population choose to eat meat. I think we'll leave it there. So, Prem, I am somewhat bewildered as to how you've gone from being a vegan for 15 years to a hardcore carnivore, eating raw meat. So how's that happened?
I'm bewildered as well, to be honest. I couldn't have predicted this in 1,000 years, you know. It's literally just happened by following my gut, literally. Because I was in such pain and so ill in my digestive area that I tried everything. Like whatever I ate, I'd have to like go to bed and just lie in pain for hours. And so I was ready for anything, you know. I was desperate for healing. And as soon as I had a purely meat meal, it was like a light bulb moment across every cell in my body. So it's just been a progression from that. So I started with cooked, and it felt really great. And then someone suggested I try raw. I tried raw, and because I was so sensitive still down there, I could feel it was another level yet.
Yeah.
Like cooked, you don't have the enzymes. You've modified it quite a bit, and there's nothing wrong with a little bit of cooked. But if you're only having cooked, like if I just start having cooked meat, which I've experimented, it's like my digestion grinds to a bit of a halt again in comparison to how
Is that
it
because
feels.
do you think partly because of some of the vegetable oils that are used to cook the meat?
Well, that's a big part of why meat wouldn't be good in any case, would be because of those things, because of the antibiotics raising them and then the vegetable
Yeah, no,
oils
of
cooking
course.
them. But no, there really is something to raw meat. There really is something. Again, I'm not going to be the police of like, yeah, if you're eating a lot of meat, great, you know, have you want to eat it, have it rare. But for me personally, and I could advise someone if they want to reach optimal health, I guarantee raw meat is another level. And then if you need confirmation, you look at the tribes, you know, and many of them had some raw meat. Now, it's rarely all raw meat. They enjoyed some cooked, but almost every tribe I come across, if you really go into them and go far back enough, they would always eat the liver raw. And like even brain raw, like they just understood that you don't mess with that. It's so healing that you have that. Usually the hunters, it was their prize. They'd have it raw.
So that's the best thing for your digestive system at the
Literally.
moment. Having experimented with cooked meat, slightly cooked meat, and raw meat, that's the best thing for your digestive system.
Literally. So it's just by following my gut now. It's like I think that expression is right in more than one way.
It's literal,
Literal. So, to summarise, what would you like to say to our viewers?
So I'd say that there's no evidence that the vegan diet is able to sustain health in a population over multiple generations. It's a fundamentally nutritionally deficient or nutrient deficient diet, and it's not something I would recommend to my patients. I think an optimal human diet should consist of grass-fed organic meat. Keep processed meat to an absolute minimum, in fact eliminate it. Fish, keep carbohydrates to an absolute minimum, 0 sugar, some nuts, seeds and fruit is probably what constitutes an optimal human diet.
Okay, thank you.
You're very
Thank you. And to finish, would you like to try raw steak for the first time?
What would you like to offer me? Yeah.
It's good quality grass-fed. Well, this is just sirloin. Local grass fed, just grab the thing.
Fine.
That's how we eat it. Yay!
Cheers.
We got an official NHS doctor trying the primal diet. Awesome. Thanks a lot, mate. Cheers.
Absolute pleasure. Cheers.
Cheers, mate.